Joining me once again now is my good friend Helaine Olen. Helaine, as you should know, if you don't, is an opinion writer for the Washington Post. She keeps putting out great stuff, and as long as she keeps doing that, we'll have her on, and maybe we will anyway. But Helaine, this time in studio, by the way, we're delighted to have you here on the program.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and you've written some great stuff lately. But we always just kind of freelance when we talk. So or freewheel.
Okay.
So freelance is a sensitive word for writers. But um, uh, so let's just start with this week. I'm talking a fair amount on this week's show about Netroots Nation because we were both there.
Right.
What were just briefly, what were your takeaway impressions of, this is a yearly gathering for progressives and of a certain type, a subset of progressives arose, as you know, out of the blogging community of the 2005 era or so. So what was your impression of this year's event?
Well, my first impression was, I think we've had enough presidential forums. I mean, it was like 4 people showed up: Gillibrand, Inslee, Castro, and Warren. Warren was, the best, but she always is. I mean, it's becoming a little, as a reporter, it's becoming kind of tiresome. It's like, oh, Elizabeth Warren, she did another great performance at a forum. Yay, Elizabeth Warren. It's like, all right, we get it. It's time to move on. So that's not on her, but it's like, I think the forum format is kind of coming to its natural end, right? So that was part of it. I don't know. I mean, I should say, I'd never been to Netroots before. I've somehow managed to never go, despite the fact that you'd think I would have at some point. So this was my first, and I'm guessing based on this one, it was probably my last. It just felt, I don't know, a little sad and lost. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It just didn't feel very energetic. Felt like a lot of DC insiders came down. One of the things I thought was sort of hilarious was that even though Sanders wasn't there, his staff appeared to be swarming the place.
Right.
Which I thought was like, what's that about? Keeping tabs, are you? And then, of course, the column I ended up writing was about the presidential forum, ... So as I say, they don't make news, they do. The Julian Castro question, where he was questioned by a woman who had lost her job in the Toys R Us bankruptcy. And she said, what are you going to do to help us with private equity and how we're losing jobs over these investment firms that are putting money into businesses, taking money out of businesses for their own profit. And he didn't either suffered brain freeze or didn't seem to know what the heck she was talking about, because he immediately replied, well, I don't believe any company is too big to fail. But that's not the point. The point is companies that are bought out by private equity are often actually being set up to fail. This is how they make money, is they load this up with debt and then take the interest off of the debt as payment, and and just keep cutting and cutting and cutting until the whole thing sort of goes kafooey. So, and in the Toys R Us instance, that was with 33,000 jobs lost.
And you know who would have nailed that question?
Elizabeth Warren.
Right.
Released a plan today about it.
Right. So what you have, it's interesting, your observation about the presidential forums. What you have is, it's a great indicator of whether a candidate is good at presidential forums. That's my takeaway.
Right.
Which is, once you become president, you're not going to engage in any presidential forums. So, I think if they're well conducted, they may tell you something about the candidate, but in a sense, it's almost the talent portion of the beauty pageant. That's my primary criticism. I actually thought, for all my criticisms of Marcos Melitsas, who is one of the founders of this gathering, the blogger, I thought he and his partner did a decent job. But I get what you're saying. I think one of the limitations of this forum was that, aside from Warren, you had no first-tier candidate.
Right, and I think that, to be fair, is part of why it lacked a certain energy. It just sort of felt like, why are we all here? I thought some of the panel sessions were very good, but it's not like it's stuff, if you don't know it, you wouldn't know it. It was kind of, it's already stuff that's out there. So, and I think most of the people who are there are fairly engaged. I mean, that being said, I spoke to several people who had, like, local Philadelphia people or, mainline suburb people who would come in for the day. And I mean, I'm talking like women in Indivisible, and they just loved it. They were like, this was so energizing. It was so great to see all of this. There had been, 3 of the 4 members of the squad in the morning, Ilhan Omar, who else? Rashida Tlaib and Ocasio-Cortez was not there.
And by the way,
yeah.
Ilhan Omar was all over this
Right.
this gathering.
And she was terrific, by the way.
And I did a panel with her. She was the host of a panel, and there were 3 panelists, and I was one of them. And the fascinating thing to me about her is that, unlike other politicians, she actually asked us questions and appeared genuinely interested in us and our answers. And this sense from a politician of interest in others is one that's almost alien to me. And I've met a lot of politicians, but she really seemed to be, well, what do you think? Either she's got the gift of faking it, which a lot of politicians do, or she has an unusual personality for a politician.
Right. I actually was thinking about that. I was talking about this with somebody today. I felt seeing her there at Netroots, I felt like she, really knows the issues, and this is something that should be highlighted a lot more. It feels like it's almost been lost in all the controversy. No, she's actually, I mean, she's a substantial person and she has a substantial background. Yes, she was an immigrant, and yes, she's become a citizen, and yes, she has certain beliefs, but, yes, and yes, she's been targeted, but, she's also there for a reason. And her politics are often quite good, but nobody is talking about that and all the horrible racism and, flame throwing and arguments between both sides. I mean, depending on what side you're talking about, right? Because when she was at Netroots, it was the Pelosi versus them. And now, of course, it's Trump versus her, which is really horrible.
Right. And that is, and believe me, that one of the striking things about meeting her too is how gentle and cultured she seems, as opposed to these sort of savage, bigots and racists who are attacking her, like Donald Trump, who's now disavowing himself from the center back chant, because obviously even his political world can't tolerate that much open racism yet. But
even he's horrified by his own supporters. No, I'm kidding.
No, he's not.
No, I know.
He's genuinely not.
I know he's genuinely not. I know.
But he's worried about funders who would finance his 2020 campaign and all that.
I was joking.
Yeah. But it's interesting what you say about Warren. Different things appeal to different people. And we could talk a lot about Bernie Sanders' absence, but personally, I think it was the right move. If I were advising Bernie this year as I was the last time around, I would have told him not to come. And I'll talk about that more in other parts of the show. But I think this is a group of people, by and large, the Netroots people. There was a lot of Bernie support there. But I think Elizabeth Warren gives them that Bernie charge, that Bernie jolt of we're challenging the system, but without going as far to challenge the system. And I like Elizabeth Warren. Right. It's not a criticism of Elizabeth Warren per se, but I think she hits a sweet spot for a lot of people we're really sticking it to the man without, and not in a gender sense, but in a power sense, without maybe threatening the power structure quite as much.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I actually think she's more threatening to the power structure, being based in New York, and how I hear people talk about her and Sanders. I actually think she's much more threatening to the power structure than Sanders, because she actually understands how the levers of the money making are working. And that's an incredibly threatening thing. I mean, I can tell you people on Wall Street are much more threatened by her than by Sanders. There's no question in my mind about this. They don't like Sanders. I mean, they think he's a socialist and they don't want any part of that. But Warren scares the living daylights out of them. It's a completely different world. And I'm always surprised people in Washington don't seem to realize that. It's Warren is the one who scares the living daylights out of them. And when I say she scares the living daylights out of them, I mean even people who are fairly left on Wall Street will embrace, various parts of her proposal. Then you'll say Elizabeth Warren, and they'll go off about whatever their particular issue is. And I always go back to a story of something that happened to me a few years ago, where I was on the beach on the North Fork of Long Island. And I actually end up talking to this rather nice elderly couple, not elderly, like 60s, right? But I'm younger, so they're elderly. And, who are next to me. And I start talking and I talk about what I do. And we start, he's a lawyer, a big, Wall Street lawyer. And we start talk, and the wife is involved in for-profit colleges. So we start talking. Yeah, it gets better. So we start talking, and Warren's name comes up, and they both go off because of each of their issues: the student loan thing, and the Wall Street stuff, and the Dodd-Frank stuff, and the consumer and the Wall Street guy hated the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And he was like, and they just went off. And I've had that experience so many times. It's a very different amount of dislike.
Well, that's interesting. And again, we're talking with Helaine Olen, political opinion columnist for the Washington Post. First of all, my theory, I have no evidence behind it and no backroom or back channel information to substantiate it. My theory is that a President Bernie Sanders would appoint Elizabeth Warren as Secretary of the Treasury.
Well, that's very sexist, though. I mean, she's perfectly qualified to be president.
No, I'm not. I said a president. I'm not eliminating the possibility.
Okay.
I'm not saying that's my ideal scenario.
Okay.
I'm saying that if Bernie Sanders were president, he would appoint her Secretary of the Treasury. Now, if she becomes president, I'm not sure she'd appoint him anything, because although I think they have a good relationship.
Well, I also am not sure he'd appoint her anything, because there's a Republican governor of Massachusetts in the Senate.
Well, that's a good point.
Goes
that's
to a Republican, so I don't think anybody's appointing her to anything, which is fine. So I think if she has to get elected, she should stay in the Senate. But
my only point, to clear myself from the charge of sexism, was that the people you meet on Wall Street should understand that Bernie may not have the same kind of detailed level of analysis and attack that Warren does, but he would take advantage of it in some way were he to become president.
I wouldn't disagree with you, but I'm just saying, I'm telling you right now that they are much more scared of Warren. And this is, over and over again. I see this constantly. I mean, I can tell you, a month ago, my son's out in the Hamptons, and he goes out there for the weekend, and at some point, he sends me a text saying, "Mom, everyone out here hates Elizabeth Warren."
That's interesting. Now, one of the reasons for that, I think, is that Elizabeth Warren is, and has been since before she got to the Senate, incredibly blunt and direct in her criticism of the individuals and the institutions on Wall Street. I mean, I think, there's a whole narrative that says she's not as left as Bernie, and in some ways that's true, and she says she's a capitalist through and through and all that stuff, but which I think is partially calculated and probably strategically smart.
Right. Okay. I think it's true. I mean, most people in the United States identify as capitalists, even if they're technically not. I mean, that's...
Right. But I also think it was a political calculation, and probably a sound one.
Politicians are allowed to be politicians.
Right.
They're allowed.
But my point is, I guess, is this. When one of the most cathartic moments I've had in many years in Washington was when Elizabeth Warren, in the Senate, in the debate about the so-called Citigroup amendment, the one that Citigroup drafted to protect big banks, went off on the relationship between Citigroup and the Democratic Party and the revolving door between them and the Robert Rubins and all the other people who had been involved, and just kind of ripped the lid off this was secret to everybody except those of us who were following, cozy relationship between Citigroup and the Democrats. And that was an incredibly nervy thing for her to do, because she was going after not just an easy target of a Republican fat cat, she was going after Democratic fat cats and their collaborators. So, and this was while Barack Obama was president.
Right.
So, and facilitating this and
well,
going along with this.
And the conversation I talked about on the beach, I think, was still I'm pretty sure that was in 2016 when he was still president as well.
And she also has roasted these guys when they come to testify in the Senate. She's, the president.
No, she gets the levers in a way that I don't think, I'm not insulting Sanders, who I like a lot, just saying she scares these people because she understands where the levers are. And that, she was a bankruptcy attorney. I mean, this was what she did. And I don't think people can discount that level of knowledge.
No, absolutely not. So I consider her I'm a big fan of hers. Always have been. And I'll tell you a quick Elizabeth Warren story. Of my own in 2016, when I was working for the Sanders campaign, I was invited to a Democratic event that was really a Democratic establishment fundraising event. And the only time Bernie got mentioned at all during the entire night, the Bernie Sanders name was mentioned, was one of the speakers, very prominent national Democratic politician, said, "Oh, well, Bernie, he'll bring along the kids, and that'll be, it was that kind of event. So he'll be okay. In the end, he'll bring the kids." That was the way everybody was thinking. And I've met Elizabeth Warren a few times, and she saw me, and she gave me a hug, and she said, "What are you doing now?" And I said, "Well, I have to whisper it in this gathering, but I'm working for Bernie." And she sort of threw her arms up. She said, "Oh, I love Bernie. You don't have to whisper it with me." So somewhere I suspect that somewhere along the line they've worked out.
Well, they've always gotten along fairly well.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fairly well known. So, I mean, I don't think that that's a real secret. I mean, when you see them together, I saw them together last year at a Social Security event, and you can see that there's an affection there. I mean, so I think whatever is going on, they have worked out. And of course, you never can say never, but the campaigns, weird things happen, but I'm sure it will work out. Hey, neither one of them could be the nominee. You never know.
Well, that troubles me, but yes, of course.
You never know.
I would be happy to have either one of them. I would be happier than I've been ever in my lifetime with a Democratic nominee. Let's switch gears a little bit. And again, Helaine Olen, opinion columnist for the Washington Post. Let's talk about another big news story going on right now, which is the Jeffrey Epstein case.
Oh, do we have to? No, I'm kidding.
We don't have to.
No, I'm kidding. No, I'm happy to talk about it.
Something else?
I mean, no, I just meant it's so gross and it's so disgusting.
And it's going to get grosser and more disgusting.
Oh, it's going to be a horror show, and it's going to be a bipartisan horror show.
That's
because
exactly
sexual perversion doesn't know political boundaries here, and it seems to be very clear.
And
that
collusion and almost accomplice after the fact behavior on behalf of a billionaire or rich person who is a sexual offender. It also knows no party distinctions because we have a politically corrupt, money-driven electoral system. I
mean, the whole thing is just such a searing indictment of, the past several decades of our public life. I mean, the essential story is for all of you who've been in a hole somewhere and haven't heard news in weeks, which I doubt, is, Jeffrey Epstein was, a Manhattan player, so to speak, who of course, was molesting young girls under the age of 18. And eventually went to jail for this for a very short period of time. But both before and after he did this, especially before, he was the toast of Manhattan and Florida society, right? And, even though it is incredibly well known that he seems to be, surrounded by a load of young girls that are probably maybe at best 18. I mean, it seemed kind of hard to believe that people didn't really realize how young some of these girls were.
Number of them were several years younger.
Yeah, and several of them were younger. But I'm trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. They thought they were 18.
You mean the people who were socialized?
Right.
Yeah.
But secondarily, he has this ton of money. He claims to be a billionaire. He's probably worth at least $500 million, okay? And people are making it out like, oh, he's not a billionaire. Guess what? He's still worth a heck of a lot of money. That nobody seems to know where the heck it comes from. He claimed to be this champion investor. There's nobody on Wall Street who's ever seen the guy work.
Right.
I mean, it's, and these guys all know each other. I mean, and I notice I say guys because they're almost all men.
Right.
But they all know each other. So that, if nobody's run into Epstein over a 30-year period is kind of mysterious and weird. And, why does he own this house? And why did Wexner, the head of Limited, give him the house? And nobody seems to know.
Right.
And was he blackmailing people? Was he just a really good investor who was just, sitting at his computer all day, day trading? Was he, a foreign agent of some sort, which is another one of the rumors going around?
It is
nobody seems to know what the guy did. And I'm not endorsing any of this, by the way. I need to say that. I have no clue, but it's very clear that he probably wasn't running a hedge fund at this point.
The fact is that each of these theories, which sounds preposterous on the
Right.
face of it to any rational mind,
Mm.
has been seriously raised as a possibility.
Right.
And the fact is, we don't know what this guy did, but for a living.
Right.
But whatever we do know that about the suppressed documents that are about to come out anytime now. We do know about the past history, the evidence showing sexual improprieties, molestation, essentially statutory rape of young girls. We do know all of the above. We do know that Bill Clinton flew on his plane. We do know that Donald Trump also partied with
Right.
him, and at one point said, well, he likes beautiful women a little younger than I do.
And by the way, I'm told, though I'm not going to remember the name of the congressman, that video that was on NBC this week, apparently people have said there was a Democratic congressman at the time in the background.
Which video?
You know, there was a video yesterday of the party with Epstein and Trump.
Oh, okay.
Apparently, there were some people claiming there was a congressman in the background in one of the in one of the shots. I don't remember the name of the guy. It was somebody from the 90s, but...
Well, I think it can be assumed that Democratic figures as well as Republican may be involved in this document release. And of course, we don't know, I mean, we know Bill Clinton was on the plane, met with him. That doesn't mean anything improper went on. There's no evidence either way. But
right, like the New York Post had a photo of Ehud Barak, the former, Prime Minister of Israel, going into his house a few years ago. Like, why was he there?
Right,
like,
they said, and one of the sneak previews of the document said one well-known prime minister
right.
Might have been Ehud Barak, might have been somebody else. But the big picture here is one that I kind of had this thought, but you expressed it in words, which is, you describe it as potentially one of the defining events of our era. And, a lot of us, I suspect you as well as I, have been thinking in terms of, we're clearly in another Gilded Age.
Right.
We're clearly in another age of wretched, decadent, Caligula-like excess, right? And yet there hasn't been any singular, and I've written about it in different ways. There was an event for young trust fund billionaires under 25 on how to be philanthropists that I saw sort of encapsulated and network with one another. And, so we've all kind of probed at it from different ways, but I got the sense reading you that you saw this as, well, you mentioned Marie Antoinette, that this could almost be like the defining event. Well, you use the phrase. That in what way is it the defining?
It's a defining event because it gets at a lot of the lies of our time. We're told we live in a meritocracy. We live in no such thing, right?
Right.
In fact, the fact of the matter is your chances of moving, up the income ladder are not particularly good, especially if you're born near the bottom. Whereas conversely, if you're born near the top, it takes almost an act of God to toss you out, right? So you've got that. But the second part is it's because we live in a meritocracy, we're constantly told these people who are kind of really super wealthy are better than us.
Right.
I mean, people don't quite put it that way, but that's essentially what they're saying over and over again. They're smarter, their behaviors are better. There's this entire genre of articles, what the 10 habits of wealthy people. I'm always fascinated by this. They go to bed early, they get up early, they don't buy lattes.
They're on the exercise cycle by 4:30.
Right.
They're done reading the news by 5:45. Right. I've seen them all.
Right. And this is all BS. I mean, I always laugh because I live in Manhattan. I mean, so as I've said before, right? I mean,
I'm a writer, so I shouldn't name publications, but Business Insider, those places.
But I mean, like, I see wealthy people a lot. I mean, they're like not unknown to me. I mean, I see them like, in their natural habitat, so to speak. And like, this is totally untrue. I mean, some of them get up early, sure. Some of them exercise, sure, right? But this isn't why they're wealthy. I mean, this isn't because, they're not like, as far as I can tell, they all go to Starbucks like anybody else. they don't there's this whole idea, they give up luxury so
See,
that they
if I had
save
$1
their
billion,
money, right? Like, that's not true.
if I had $1 billion, I would definitely hire somebody to go to Starbucks for me. I don't like waiting online.
Well, there was one guy, I forget which billionaire it was, who actually met his second wife online at Starbucks. It was tabloid story because, of course, he was married to his first wife at the time.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, it was not Howard Schultz. I forget who it was. It was some guy with an H, Harvey something or other. But but anyway, my point is this idea, they eschew luxuries. I mean, if they've been in Manhattan, like, the place is luxury city. Like, come on.
Right,
They don't eschew luxuries. I mean, come on. In fact, one of my favorite studies came out years ago. I was still working on Pound Foolish, so at least a decade ago now, was somebody actually went in and looked at, like, very affluent multimillionaires and what their habits were. And I remember reading the entire study, and as I put it, I said the only thing they actually had in common with the middle class was their deep belief that they thought they were middle class. I mean, these people were hiring concierge medical practices and traveling constantly, and
I put out on social media a picture I took in San Francisco last week that was, I forget the headline, but it was concierge marijuana delivery. And it was, you get to pick remotely, and then you call them, and you tell them what your particular needs or desires are, and this concierge medical delivery of marijuana. So yeah, I mean, they like their luxuries. Of course, they like their luxuries,
which is fine on one.
But you're describing.
I mean, it's just fine on one basic level. People are human. They're allowed to. I just want to make this clear. People are allowed to like luxury. I have nothing against it.
Sure.
But what I'm describing is, we're digressing a bit, right? That what I'm describing is these are not self-denying people. These are people who are often, when you look at behavioral finance studies, people who are wealthy are often very cut off. They're actually less likely to give to philanthropy than people who have less money, which is always kind of fascinating, right? Because we have this whole idea.
Well, on a percentage basis.
On a percentage basis, yeah.
Yes, I've seen those studies too.
Yeah, I mean, if
they develop as a group. Obviously, individuals may vary, but as a group, they tend to develop or lose empathy.
They tend to lose empathy. I mean,
responses.
And there's been hilarious studies. I mean, I can cite several of my favorites. There's one study where they looked at people's behavior at stop signs, and the quote, better the make of the car, the less likely they were to stop the frickin' stop sign. I mean, there's another one that also really fascinated me was the wealthier people were, the more likely they were to if you gave them a jar of candy and said it was for kids, the more likely they were to take the damn candy.
That's hilarious.
I mean, and the third one, I just have to tell you one other one, and this is actually very relevant, is that somebody a few years ago had the idea to put Google Glasses on people and send them walking down the street. And what they found is the more wealthy you were, or reported to be, right? They weren't looking at their taxes, the less you looked around, right?
Interesting.
Like when I walked down the street, I was like this. I mean, you can tell because you can see me on camera. I do this all the time.
Right, I do it too.
But people who are wealthier, I mean, not always, but often are like that.
Yeah, and what you're describing, this idealization of this set of people, to me, it goes back to, I think of, for example, Napoleon Hill's book from the 1920s, Think and Grow Rich, right? Where basically the entire premise of the book, which turns out to have been somewhat of a fraud. He says he went out and talked to
all these books are frauds. That's a whole other subject.
He didn't even talk to them. He says that I forget which super wealthy J. Pierpont Morgan or somebody told him to write it. He never met J. Pierpont. But whatever. The point being, the book was a bestseller because people think how these people have qualities that if I emulate, they are the most deserving in society, so I should emulate them so that I get more because distribution is based on who deserves it, which is an entirely false premise. And I guess what you're saying about Jeffrey Epstein and the disproving of this is that, in fact, if you look at a number of ultra-wealthy people, some of them may have done it because they're brilliant computer scientists or whatever, but by and large, they get their, and my theory is, if they either inherited it or they've gotten there because of personality traits that most of us would consider sociopathic.
Right, I would agree with you.
And I would include, for example, Mark Zuckerberg in that. Mark Zuckerberg didn't design a very good software product. He wasn't that brilliant an engineer. Facebook was always, and I used to work in that field, was always crap from a user interface perspective.
It's still an extremely buggy program.
Well, now
not a program, I mean a platform.
Now it's not buggy. Now
it's still pretty buggy. If you
no,
ask
the
me.
things you don't like are designed because you're not the customer. So they are designed to elicit behavior in you that the true customers of Facebook, who are the people buying the data.
Oh, no. But I even find like sometimes you'll get a notification and you click on it and it just won't open up for a while.
Oh, well, that's buggy.
That's
okay.
buggy. I mean, I'm talking, no, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I don't mean that. I mean, that sort of behavior is like when they send me a notification 8 times for the same thing. They're clearly looking to engage me. Right?
Well, but what you're describing there is a manifestation of monopoly.
Right.
And for example, I'm on the Apple platform, which I love in a lot of ways, very beautifully designed in certain ways, but there's a lot that's lousy in the Apple platform too. So, but I guess what you're really, and I have written about Steve Jobs, who's probably the most admired of all the recent billionaires, pointing out some of the pretty sociopathic things. And Steve Jobs,
horrible.
Steve Jobs knew that people were burning to death in Foxconn factories. He didn't do anything about it because he wanted those new screens for the iPhone. There's an iPhone right here, fast. And if people died, he may not have thought about it that way, but his behavior, he was warned in writing that this was going on. We've had William K. Black on, we've documented this on this program. So I guess what you're saying, and we have to start to wind up, but I guess what you're saying about Jeffrey Epstein case, I mean, I thought of it as representing our era because of the depravity, but you're saying it's not just the depravity, I almost interpret you as saying it's the Wizard of Oz. It's pulling the curtain back on the Wizard of Oz, right?
Right. I mean, it gets at every, as I said in the piece, it gets at every foundational myth about our culture. And it, and by the way, the whole skankiness of his deal is part of it too, because it just unravels all the corruption. So it's everything. It's literally everything. It's the level of corruption. It's the level of insider dealing. It's the level of celebrity worship for no reason. It's sexual perversion. It's the meritocracy, the treatment of women over and over again. The value of scandal and celebrity over moral behavior. It's kind of everything. It's like a pinball machine of like every myth about our culture.
And let us not forget the objectification of women, which runs through,
right.
Which runs through, and of young girls, which runs through all of this too. I mean, to me, the culture, obviously there's a qualitative difference, but the designer fashion companies that put anorexic 15-year-old girls in their ads and then Photoshop them to make them even thinner so that they're actually thinner than the human anatomy could survive in real life, and then present that as the ideal of beauty, is not entirely disconnected from the society that can look the other way at the sexual depravity of a Jeffrey Epstein.
I agree. I mean, what I always say about scandals is, and this is a book I will probably never make the time to write, but I've always wanted to write, is I've wanted to look at various scandals in time and what they said about society. Because, obviously awful things happen every day. So why does one thing become a scandal and why does something else not? And why do some scandals persist 20 years later, like say, Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, or this Epstein scandal, which I can tell you is going to last for a very long time. So it's already lasted, by the way. Whenever someone says, oh, no, it won't, I'm like, it's already lasted 10 years. Of course it's going, more than 10 years, 12 years, right? People were writing, never mind. People were first writing about Epstein in 2002, 2003, right? Scandals tell you something about your moment in time and what that is. And they tend to define their period at a certain point. And you have to start asking, what is it about this one that has gone so long? I mean, besides the obvious just disgustingness of it, because we don't approve of, raping children in our culture. What is it? Why did this persist? What does it say about us as a society? Because that's ultimately what a scandal is about. It's about society either attempting to impose its morals on somebody, or why those morals aren't being, and beliefs, or why those things aren't being enforced.
Yeah, if Jeffrey Epstein were a working class black man.
Oh, he'd be long gone.
Right, so that's...
We would have never heard about him, they never would have made the first million, I mean, the whole thing.
Yeah, all right, so he's the real life Marie Antoinette of our time, or something much, much worse. But anyway, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Helaine Olen, opinion columnist for the Washington Post, glad you could join us in person, and thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
It was a delight. And we